the main message, I think, of Stoicism. It's not saying, giving you an intellectual regimen. It's not giving you a physical regimen, though he recommends things in both regards. But what Seneca and the Stoics are saying is that achieving a kind of emotional perspective and maturity is the key to managing everything else in your life.
Welcome to Stoic Conversations. In this podcast, Michael Tremblay and I discuss the theory and practice of Stoicism. Each week we'll share 2 conversations, one between the 2 of us, and another will be an in-depth conversation with an expert. In this conversation, I speak with the poet, Dana Gioia. The Stoic philosopher Seneca may be most well known for his practical philosophical work. However, he was also a playwright. Dana Gioia recently published his translation of Seneca's Hercules Furens, entitled Seneca, the Madness of Hercules. In addition to his poetic translation of the play, it has a fine critical introduction to Seneca, his life, work, and the influence he had on later figures like Shakespeare. So all that is the focus of the conversation today. However, we really talk about much more. The polymathic Tyler Cowen once called Dana Gioia an information billionaire, which seems like a apt description to me. He's written criticism, poetry, read more than nearly anyone, but also marketed Jell-O and led the National Endowments for the Arts. We discuss his story, Seneca, Stoicism, poetry, and art. Dana's wisdom and generosity shine throughout the conversation. Enjoy. Welcome to Stoic Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros, and today I have the honor of speaking with Dana Gioia. Thanks for having me here.
Well, it's a very manageable honor, I think, to speak to me. I'm glad to meet you, and I think we should have fun talking.
Yeah, so you recently translated Seneca's Hercules Furens, which we'll get into. But before we do that, let's start with a really broad question. What's your story?
I think the best way to describe my rather unusual career is to say that I'm a working class guy from LA. My dad was Sicilian, my mom was Mexican. I was the first person in my family to go to college. I knew from a pretty early age that I wanted to be somehow involved in the arts, but I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know anybody that didn't have a manual labor job or a kind of low-level service job. And so it was largely a fantasy life that I had. And so I was a musician when I was early on. I started learning piano in parochial school. In high school, I played piano, saxophone, clarinet. When I went to college, I went to Stanford. I decided I was going to be a composer. Then when I was about just shy of 20, I simply woke up one day and realized that I would be a poet. Now, it sounds odd, it sounds pretentious, but somehow my unconscious had sorted that through. I always liked poetry. Like everybody else, I'd written a lot of bad poems, but I understood that's what I wanted to do, and I had no idea what it meant. So the rest of my life has been figuring out, what does it mean to be a poet? How does a poet make his way through life, and how do you pay the bills? Because I knew I wanted to get married. I wanted to have, a family. And so I went to graduate school first because I'm a poet. You should be a professor. Isn't that the conventional thing? And I went to Harvard Graduate School. I liked graduate school. I liked Harvard in most respects. It's a bit snobbish, and I can say that because I went there. But I do think people at Harvard are a little too proud of the fact that they are at Harvard. But nonetheless, it's a superb school. I had a good time there. But I realized after a couple of years that being a professor was very different from being a writer. And that the longer I stayed at Harvard, actually the worse I would get as a poet, because I'd be writing poems too self-consciously. I'd be writing poems to be analyzed, rather than this weird kind of communication which is the way poetry works. We can talk about that in a little while. So I decided to quit. I'd had jobs, believe it or not, since the age of 9. And so I had no illusions about having a shit job somewhere and, writing at night or, working as a night watchman or whatever. I wanted a good job. So I went to Stanford Business School because I was always pretty good at running things. I went to Stanford Business School, and I'm probably the only person in history who went there to be a poet. I did the minimum amount of work. I mean, no one has graduated doing less at Stanford Business School than I did, but I achieved 3 really good things. I got an MBA, and I learned a lot. I mean, it wasn't like it was a worthless thing. It's just that I'd always been an A student. Mm-hmm. And at Stanford Business School, I allowed myself to be the worst student in the class rather than the best student. And that was in itself an education. I realized how most people go through school. They're not that engaged. I took a lot of that time, and I spent about 3 hours every day writing or reading. And so I started publishing and matured myself a little bit as a writer. But most importantly, I met the woman I would marry. I knew that I would marry her within a few weeks of knowing her. It took her 5 years to recognize my rationale, but we've been married now for 43 years. And so I then went to New York. I was in business for 15 years. I was working at General Foods Corporation, which was the largest food company in the country at that point. And I worked about 10 hours a day, and I came home and I wrote at night. And after a number of years, I was successful in business, but I was also a very well-known poet and critic. I had a number of things happen in my life. The most significant one was that my first son died suddenly. He was 4 months old. He died of sudden infant death syndrome. And anyone who has lost a child or is in a family where they've lost a child knows the trauma that represents. And as we were coming out of that, and we had 2 more sons, I realized that, and this sounds very Seneca, I recognize mortality as a force in my life. And, you only have one chance to be in this world, even if you believe in another world. And I felt that if I was going to be a full-time writer, now was the time to do it. So I simply quit my job one day, to everybody's astonishment. I didn't have another job, and I decided that I would make my living as a writer. I was lucky because I had published an article called Can Poetry Matter? I don't know if you've read it, but it was published in 1991. It's probably still the most famous American article on poetry in the last 30 plus years. And it made me internationally famous. And so I felt that gave me an opportunity to make a living. And that's what I did. I worked for the BBC. I reviewed for the New York Times, the Washington Post. I began editing anthologies. I began doing a lot of stuff. I lived as a writer. And we had a couple of lean years, but then it began to work. I would have probably done that for the rest of my life. In the same way, I might have actually worked in business and written at night until retirement had I not lost my son, had I not had that basic existential shock. I came back to California because I was in New York for nearly 20 years. Came back to California, which is where I'm from, and where I really feel a very deep connection, much more than most people, I think, do towards the place. But I've never thought of myself as anything but California, or no matter where I was living. And then at the age of 50, I ended up taking a job I did not want, but I did out of a certain public obligation. I became the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, which was a failed institution that Congress was trying to eliminate. And so I went to Washington to save the NEA, and I'm happy to say I managed. We rebuilt the institution. We got the budget raised every year that I was there. We launched its largest programs and most successful programs in its history. And I could have then once again stayed in Washington the rest of my life. I had many, many people in Washington that wanted me to continue there, but I came back to California. I had to teach part-time for a couple of years at the University of Southern California because I had two kids, two sons in college. And also, when you're in public service, you really lose money. I didn't want to sell my house here, and so I came back and I did it. And then I had a stroke of very good fortune. Once again, that wouldn't have happened otherwise, which is that Governor Brown asked me to be California Poet State Laureate. And I did that for 4 years. And I became the only poet laureate in California's history who visited all 58 counties of the state and did events in all 58 counties, which was a kind of adventure. It was my wife and I turned it into a kind of interesting odyssey. And it was, we did it together. And then I left USC. Now that I paid the bills. I walked away from a university chair. I think people thought I was nuts.
Right.
But that's a whole other subject. But it wasn't what my destiny was. And I came back here just in time for a fire to practically burn my house down. It destroyed my neighbors. So during the pandemic, while everybody else was in complete isolation, I had people here every day, and we were cutting down burned trees, and we were rebuilding things. So for 2 years, we rebuilt this. Then I had a broken pipe that flooded the room we were in. This room was gutted 9 months ago and had to be rebuilt. So in my retirement, rather than writing full time, which I had hoped, I'd become a kind of second-rate contractor. But I actually, during that time, I finished a couple of books. And so what's my story? My story is that I'm a kid who was excited by art, was excited by literature, was excited by music, when I didn't know what they were, except as experiences. And I let that, in a sense, guide me into a life in which I worked in academics, in business, in government, in the media, and most importantly, as an independent writer working only for myself. Mm-hmm. And so I had an unusual life. It's been difficult in a lot of ways, but I can't imagine not thinking of myself as blessed when I'm able to do what I love, and I'm able to make a living with that. Mm-hmm. So there's a saying that Seneca made. It only has 5 words in Latin, but which is fata ducam voluntatem trahut in voluntatum, which means fate guides the willing person. The unwilling one, it drags behind it. And so even when my son died, I just believed that you follow your destiny and you trust where it leads. And it's usually surprising.
Yeah. Surely you must have had different opportunities come up at the time to, I don't know, say, make more money on a great book, or how'd you think about that sort of thing?
Well, when I announced that I was leaving General Foods, as vice president there, and it's a company where vice president is a very senior office. I had a agent that I happened to know socially. He was the agent for a couple of writers. He called me up, and he announced, and this would have been in 1991, end of 1991. He said that I'd heard he was quitting, and that he had put together a book deal for me, and he could offer me a $600,000 advance to write a book about how MBAs were destroying American business, which is an idea I don't totally reject. That's a whole other discussion. You'd probably get big offers like that all the time. And this is in 1991 dollars, so it would be $1 million.
Yeah, that's solid.
Yeah, $1 million or just a little bit more. And I didn't say no. I said, well, I got to talk to my wife. But I told her, and she said, well, what do you want? Do you want to do it? And if I did, I felt like I could have secured if I had done it, I could secure my future. But what I told her was this, And it sounds very corny, but I thought of Robert Frost, which is about his poem about the road not taken. And the fellow is walking it down the road. It comes to a fork, and he takes one side. And he says, "I'd like to go the other side too, but knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted I'd ever come back." And I said, well, it would be interesting. I could probably do it in 18 months. But I said, the trouble is, if I do that, I didn't quit business to write about business. I'd rather actually do business than write about business, which is not any insult to people who write about business, because I read their writing all the time. I read the Wall Street Journal every day. I said, but then I'll have to do a book that gets an $800,000 advance. And then I'll have to get a book, and I'll not write the books that I want to write. And so I called the guy up the next day, and I said, I just don't want to do it. And he was flabbergasted, because he was a good guy. He liked me and everything else. And I just said, I just don't want to do it because it's not the book I want to write. And instead, I put together Can Poetry Matter, which was a book of essays, and it sold very well by the standards of books of essays about poetry, which is, one infinitesimal fraction of what, but it was a book. And 30 years later, people still are buying and reading that book in small numbers. Please don't get me wrong. It's never been on the bestseller list, and never will be, but the book is still alive. Mm-hmm. And, the book on MBAs would not have. It would have been a year afterwards. It would have been forgotten. We were talking earlier, before the camera began, about a British writer of the 30s, 40s, and 50s named Cyril Connolly, who edited Horizon. And Connolly said that the challenge of a writer is to write a book which will still be read in 10 years. When I first read that, I said, how silly, people read books that are 2,000 years old. But I assure you, as a writer, very few books are read 10 years after their publication. And so what I tried to do in my career was to write the books or the articles or the poems that only I can write, to take my time and to write them in a way that they stay alive for more than 10 years. I think of myself, what would take this book to be alive in 50 years? Mm-hmm. In 50 years, even middle age, I'd be dead. So how can I write something that somebody in the next generation can read profitably? And Seneca sort of happened that way. And that means you don't rush them, and you go for a kind of perfectionism. Will the book pay your living? No way it will. It's just, it's an abysmal economic investment. But what it does do is to create a life which will, in its entirety, support you. Mm-hmm. People will invite you to lecture. People will invite you to teach. People will do things because they respect the imagination and the intelligence that writes that way. So all of my advice to writers is bad advice. Nothing I recommend to people will get them an agent, will get them a bestseller. But working this way, I've been able to write well, be well regarded, and make a living. Isn't that a perfect trifecta?
Right. Yeah, I suppose you can't always have all things. So
yeah.
Be careful about what you choose.
No, it is. Even there's all these sorts of things. I mean, Ray Bradbury, who I knew pretty well in his later years, used to say, jump off the cliff and build your wings on the way down. And I think that's really true. I mean, if you're determined to fly, that's the way to do it. Because the experience teaches you how to do it. Now, obviously, it's a metaphor, not an engineering idea.
Sure.
But I think it is true. You take the leap, you follow fortune, and you believe that fortune will guide you.
So how does Seneca enter the picture?
Well, Seneca, this is a project that I've been involved with for probably a quarter of a century, but it really begins when I started college. Mm-hmm. I had an old-fashioned Catholic education. They didn't emphasize mathematics or science, but by God, they taught you Latin. Because they wanted to make sure that if 18, when you graduated high school, you wanted to be a priest, you were prepared in theology or in philosophy and Latin. So I had an extraordinarily good education for the 12th century. And having been raised in late middle age Los Angeles, among people that hadn't changed since the 12th century, it never questioned me that this was anything but the right education for the future. And indeed, ironically, at the age of 72, I use my Latin, my philosophy, and my theology every day. The computer languages that I learned, the statistical methods I learned, everything went to business school I don't use. So it is practical. But anyway, I came to college. They abolished Western Civ as a requirement. And I probably, if Western civilization had been required, I probably would have complained. But since it was abolished, I decided to take it.
Yeah, then you have to take it.
So that's what I'm like. I'm just a contrarian. So I started in this. I didn't know what the hell I was signing up for, but it struck me it's a good idea to read Homer and Sophocles. And so I did this class, and we spent like 9 weeks on the Greeks, and then came to the Romans, and they said, well, Romans are just not as good as the Greeks, and we'll spend like a day, reading. Seneca spent a day reading Cicero, and that was it. They just said, well, and I sort of said, gee, So when I read Seneca, and they were giving his essays, I said, this is really good. I find this much more useful than reading Plato. Now I know that's an abomination to say in a department of philosophy, but Seneca was not interested in giving you the abstract theoretical system for philosophy. What he was interested in doing was giving you a practical worldview that you could apply. And when I was reading this, I said, my Mexican and Sicilian families, the men are Stoics. This is the philosophy that they practice. And I just thought this is what my uncles were like. This is what my grandfather's like. I hadn't thought of it as a philosophical system. But anyway, I liked it. And the rest of my education, I kept waiting for Seneca to reappear. I took a huge year-long class on the tragedy, taught by the head of the Spanish department. Now, Seneca was born in Spain, for God's sakes, when it was part of the Roman Empire. And we read Racine, Corneille, we read all the Greeks, we read Tirso de Molina, we read Lope de Vega, we read Shakespeare, we read Schiller. He didn't cite any Seneca. And it sort of puzzled me that you wouldn't do it. And so finally, in graduate school, I didn't get it. And I was doing work on Elizabethans, just coursework. And it was very important for me because I actually scanned every line of several plays because I wanted to teach myself as a poet how Shakespeare and his contemporaries had written blank verse. Because it was a performative art. They were doing it for the theater. So they were doing it by the way it sounded. So I did that. And at the beginning of his book on Elizabethan drama, Eliot writes, really was my book, I think the last really great literary essay on Seneca. And I read it and I said, this is really fascinating. So about the time I dropped out of graduate school, I read a play of Seneca's. And see, now you got to understand, the plays of Seneca are contemptible. They're violent, they're vulgar, they're badly written. They copy the Greeks too much, but they aren't enough like the Greeks. I mean, there's all these reasons to hate them. And nobody ever says a good thing. So I read it. I said, man, this is a hell of a play. It's the Thyestes, which is, and it begins with a fury meets a ghost. And they're talking, it's almost like a no play of the Japanese. And I just thought it was wonderful. So I started reading these other plays of Seneca, and I really liked them. So clearly I'm defective in the same way that Seneca, but the fact is that the Seneca plays are much more like the movies we have now. It's like, it reminds me of Quentin Tarantino is pure Seneca, which is that these people just come and just give speeches. And the speeches are exciting. I'm going to blow this poor college kid drug dealer up, but before I do, I'm going to give him this long speech. And people. I remember seeing Pulp Fiction, which I have certain problems with Pulp Fiction. I mean, I don't think it's the great film the way my sons do. But by God, Tarantino was doing something nobody else did, which is having violence and rhetoric and poetry together. And that's what Seneca is like. And these characters come and they just give you a speech to knock you out of your seat, and then they go off and murder somebody, and so I had a chance to do a version of this about 20 years ago. And so I did a version, and we produced it in Lower Manhattan. And this guy I used to go out drinking with this one. He comes to poetry meetings. Afterwards, we go to these bars. And it's a work night. It's 2 a.m. We're still in these damn bars. And we're just talking about books. And I tell him about this thing. I don't know how to put it on. He says, I'll pay to put it on. I said, how can you do it? He says, I don't make that much money, but I spend it all. Why don't I spend this on? He decides that, and I just saw this guy about a couple months ago. He moved back to the Bay Area, and he loved actors, and he kind of been in theater and stuff like that. So he brought together this group of actors. We did a semi-stage production of it, 2 nights in a pretty big place. We packed it, and I said, well, I don't want any of the actors to try to make this like a modern play.
Right.
I want this to feel ancient. I want it to feel foreign. And I want you to come on the stage, and I want you to give these speeches to terrify the audience. Just belt it out, to make it like opera. And we did it, and the audience was like, whoa. And then they just got into it. And then, it was over. I mean, it wasn't like I think we actually had enough gate that he was able to pay the actors just through the gate. So I didn't force him into financial ruin. He did that later on his own. But he's Richard Ryan, great guy. And so then it was a version of it was published in this Johns Hopkins Roman drama series, which was a disappointing venture in many ways. It was just but I always said I want to get back to this, and I want to bring it out as an ideal thing. So I didn't do it for a number of years, but it was always in my list. This is what I wanted to do. So when I quit my job after the fire, it's basically being of a fire, I started working on it again. And so I took a shorter essay that I wrote, and I rewrote it. I went through maybe 18, 20 drafts, and it got longer and longer and better and better. And I did it because I wanted to write an essay that not only explained Seneca and explained Seneca's drama, but to a certain degree expressed my outrage that this guy had been written out of the canon, and that he'd been so, I think, willfully misunderstood. And then I took the translation, and I just worked on it because I wanted a translation that when you heard it, you knew you were hearing poetry. Mm-hmm. And I had certain sections that before that you could actually just perform as a poem, and people would go, wow, what a great poem. And so that's what I brought out. So I think it's the first serious attempt to revive Seneca, for about 100 years. And it's the second, there's only been 2 translations of the play in the history of English. The first one was done by John Donne's uncle. That's how far back it is. Jasper Haywood, who was a Jesuit and also a sort of Catholic spy eventually. And he did it for this edition of Seneca. Seneca was the first first classical playwright to be translated in English. So Shakespeare would have read these translations. And in fact, one of the few things we know about Shakespeare, because people were saying, well, he doesn't have very good Latin or Greek, but one of them says, well, Shakespeare in English read by candlelight produces, many good plays. And the guy was complimenting Shakespeare. So it was that. And then the second one was a kind of academic or translation, I think 1911, I think it was, something in the early part of the century, which was it wasn't trying to be poetic, it was just trying to give you and this guy actually also did Trot, which is a literal translation. So this is really the first attempt to make Shakespeare work, make Seneca, Madness of Hercules work as poetry since Shakespeare's time. actually a little bit before Shakespeare's time. And so, it's up to you to let me know whether it's any good. But I gave it my all because I didn't, because you're writing, very play. It's very easy to say, well, this part of the play is not very good. I'll just
Right. I'll just
no. Why did he write it this way? And I tried to make everything work. Now you could say not everything I did work, but it's because I failed. Now, I didn't try. But I feel pretty proud of it.
Yeah.
Because you get a sense of the power of the characters. The actress who did the version in Soho is, kind of a very, she's a very powerful, she's good looking, but what you really noticed about her was just she was a powerful woman. And like all actresses in New York, she needed work. And so after we did this, I said, if I get a gig to read poetry, will you come and just do this? And so I would go to a poetry reading, and I would do some poems. She would come out and she'd do Juno's monologue, which is the entire first act of this play. And then I would do some more. And people loved it. This actress loved it because, she'd learned this part and now she got to use it. But I found that it was very dangerous because this is a crazy, vengeance-ridden goddess who wants to, been trying to destroy Hercules since he was a baby. She tried to destroy him in his cradle. And she's getting madder and crazier, nuttier, and it's all vengeance. And afterwards, the women in the audience would come up and say, I really loved that thing that you did for Juno. She's so right about me. So right. They said, whoa, murder, let's not murder people. But I felt a certain degree it was a little like Quentin Tarantino. These are wild and violent speeches, and it makes sense within a drama.
Sure.
If you exert it, it's not a moral example. You don't take that's not the character you should be basing them around. Or Hercules. See, the thing about this play,
well, let's give people a quick précis about the play, because I think many listeners will be familiar with Seneca, but they may have taken a look at one of his plays, if any at all. And if you've done that, you probably will be surprised if you're familiar with his moral philosophy, perhaps.
What do people know? What does the average person or average literate person know about Hercules? Two things. He was the strongest person who ever lived. He had such incredible strength that nothing could defeat him. And the second thing is that through, one of his irresponsible acts of violence, he had to make amends by doing 12 labors for King Eurystheus. And so the king kept sending him labors, hoping that he would die. Things like they were all impossible labors. And so this play begins when Hercules has just finished his 12th and final labor, which, if you remember, is to go into the underworld and bring back Cerberus, the three-headed dog. And so because of this triumph that he's done of, basically fighting every monster on Earth, Hercules is going to be made into a god. And this is what just really annoys Juno, because Juno is the wife of Jupiter. She's all Hera and Zeus would be their Greek names. And she's also, this is a little kinky, she's also Jupiter's sister. They're rather like, some
very incestuous
Egyptian royal families, they marry within the family. And Jupiter has not been a faithful husband. And she's been continuously humiliated by his bastards, his mistresses. And quite often he rewards them by making them into stars, deifying them. So she's drawing the line of Hercules. So Hercules doesn't know this, but Juno was plotting to get him as he comes out of hell. So he comes back to his native city and discovers there's been a coup. This king has been killed, and the usurper has given Hercules' wife an ultimatum that she either marries him or he will kill her and all of Hercules' children. And he thinks Hercules has perished in the underworld. And he's about to get a violent surprise. So Hercules comes back to Thebes. He finds out the situation. He kills the usurper. But because, and this gets into dark magic to a certain degree, that all mythologies have the gods above and the gods below. Even Christianity, I'm a Catholic, we have the gods, and what's below is the demonic portion of reality. Angels and demons, gods above and gods below. And what, like Las Vegas, what's in Hades must stay in Hades. If you bring things out of Hades, you unleash dangers into the upper world. This has become the plot of, I don't know how many horror films or TV series.
Sure.
But Seneca was there first, And so Hercules does not understand that by dragging Cerberus, who is the sacred guardian of the underworld, he's unleashed all of these furies and spirits, and that's what Juno uses implicitly. It's not. It's not. She talks about it, but you don't see it on the stage. Drives him mad. He goes mad, and he kills his own family, and then he comes out of the madness. So it's the tragedy of Hercules Furens, which means Hercules gone mad, is that the strongest man in the world who cannot be defeated by going mad uses his strength to defeat himself. And so at the end of the play, he's basically being taken off stage by King Theseus, who he's saved from the underworld to a place where he can redeem his life. And but as mythology shows, all of Hercules' greatest deeds are now, for the most part, behind him. He has been a bad ending, as people know from mythology, where he's tricked by a centaur. His wife's tricked by a centaur by putting on a poisonous shirt, which he cannot remove, and has to find an elaborate way of killing himself. So this is really a tragedy of strength without judgment. That you can be the strongest person in the world, but if you do not control your anger, you do not control your vengeance, that strength cannot protect you or your family. Very Seneca.
Right.
So it's an exciting play. The interesting thing, the thing that I really loved about it, which was drew me to it, is that the third act of this is a description of the underworld. Because Theseus has come up and everyone wants to know, well, what the heck?
What's next?
What's hell like? And he tells them, and it's terrifying. And I am absolutely sure that Dante read this, and it's reflected in Dante's Inferno. And people never talk about that. They always talk about he's borrowing from Virgil and Homer. But this is something Dante would have known from school days on. And so it's a wonderful, dark, poetic, violent play that's full of great poetry. So what's not to like? I'm a guy from LA. I was raised by the movies, monster movies especially.
A common criticism of Seneca's plays is that they're crude, or they spend too much time in the perverse without anything to show. Like maybe one angle on this is you have the distinction between curiositas and studiositas, where there's a sort of perverse curiosity in the gladiatorial games or the plays, perhaps, of a gory nature, as opposed to more serious seeking. How do you think about that? How do you sort of answer that general impression?
Here's this. Do we like to read Jane Austen? Yeah, we do. Jane Austen, reflects a kind of relatively tranquil part of British history. There's wars and slavery and everything in the background, but things are basically good in Jane Austen land. On the other hand, do we like to read The Master and Margarita by Bulgakov or Solzhenitsyn, or these things that Mandelstam, Monica, that come out of this Stalinist terror? And we do, because in our lives, there's peace, there's war, there's justice, there's injustice, there's democracy, there's totalitarianism. And it would be, I think it's a naivete to expect that somebody working in a court of Nero, This is Seneca. Virgil is born in the Roman Republic and lives through the civil wars at the time of Augustus. So he sees the end of the Republic. He sees the violence, the political chaos brings, and then he sees a great emperor who brings the Pax Romana, the peace to Europe. And Seneca is essentially raised under, Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius and Nero. He has no memory of the Republic. What he's seen are increasingly bad, violent, and in some cases mad emperors. And he's struggling, and you see this in his essays. You certainly see it in the accounts of his life, and you see it most clearly in the tragedies. What do you do when you're living in a world where you could just be killed by the government the next day, without justice, or could be tortured, you could be imprisoned, your family's in danger. And so Seneca is the acid test of Stoicism. Now, you say, well, Marcus Aurelius, but Marcus Aurelius is emperor, Now, Seneca was essentially the prime minister. Seneca understood even as prime minister, you could be killed. And indeed he was.
He was,
killed.
right.
His whole family was killed, in a matter of about a week. In 1 week, during the Pisonian conspiracy, this was a plot to kill Nero. Nero killed Seneca. He killed Seneca's nephew, Lucan, who was the last great epic poet of Rome, who wrote the Pharsalia, a poem about the civil wars. And he killed Petronius Arbiter, the author of the Satyricon, the author of the first Roman novel. And so in 1 week, Nero killed the 3 greatest writers of the era. And I would maintain, I've never seen anybody say this, and Roman literature never recovered. Because they killed the epic poet, they killed the dramatist and essayist, and they killed the novelist satirist. And so they killed, the 3 great traditions of Rome.
Yeah.
And Seneca is in this world. He sees, he sees the emperor kill his own mother. He sees he sees Claudius's wife commit public bigamy. And he sees all these bizarre things. And that's what he's writing out of. It's very different than Athenian democracy. And so I think Seneca is actually more relevant to contemporary readers in some ways than the Greek dramatists are, because what he's writing from is an empire gone dark. And, the American Republic, like the Roman Republic, has become a kind of imperial power. When I was in Washington, I was the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts. I would see the president and the vice president drive by with these vast motorcades of guards. It was imperial. This is not the republic that Jefferson or Adams or Madison would have envisioned. Now you could say, well, they have to, and for all these various reasons. But we've become this imperial power that is, for good. And I'm not anti-American. I don't think America is the greatest evil in the world. I really am not. But you have to notice, what we have. The immense amount of state violence that we have, of international violence we have, the world, the terrorist world, the wars that were continuing over these external wars that were continuously involved in, they're positively Roman, and that's what Seneca's writing about. American entertainment has become darker and darker and darker. I mean, Seneca's a little like Jane Austen.
Yeah, that's probably right.
Compared to Saw or something like that. Anyway, but I fell in love with Seneca as a writer, and I wanted to find a way of making it work. Mm-hmm. And the way you make it work is you translate his poetry as
poetry,
not as, well, this is some kind of Roman rhetoric. I don't know what he's doing.
I'd love to have you read some of the Madness of Hercules.
Yeah. What I wanted to do in translating Seneca was to get what I felt was the excitement of these plays, which was in the language. When people are criticizing Seneca, they criticize with so many words. It's a little like Salieri and Amadeus. Too many notes. The emperor, Joseph II. Too many notes. But the fact is that what Seneca is doing, it's not like opera. The prima donna comes out there and she just dazzles you. So this play begins at night because a tragedy should take place in one location from dawn to dusk, and all the action has the unity of time and place and action. The play has those three unities. So this Seneca sneaks a little bit. He starts before dawn. So it's night and all the stars are out. And this woman comes on stage and she's the goddess Juno. And what she begins to do is to look at this zodiac and point out that these stars, these constellations, are commemorating her husband's adulterous affairs. And she is not happy about it. So this is the way that it begins. Call me sister of the thunder god. That is the only title I have left. Once I was wife and queen to Jupiter, but now abandoned by his love and shamed by his perpetual adulteries. I leave my palace to its mistresses. Why not choose earth when heaven is a whorehouse? Even the zodiac has now become a pantheon of prostitutes and bastards. Look at Callisto shining in the north. That glittering slut now guards the Argive fleet. Or see how Taurus rises in the south, not only messenger of spring's warm nights, but the gross trophy of Europa's rape. Or count the stormy Pleiades, those nymphs who terrorized the waves, once warmed Jove's bed. Watch young Orion swagger with his sword, a vulgar upstart challenging the gods, while gaudy Perseus flaunts his golden stars. Gape at the constellations Jove awarded Castor and Pollux, his twin bastard sons. And now not only Bacchus and his mother parade their ill-begotten rank in heaven, but my great husband, lord of lechery, discarding his last shred of decency, has crowned his drunken bastard slut with stars. Now you realize this is not a woman who's going to, have a charitable look, at anyone, who her husband's produced, but she just begins by this great rant of this woman mad at her cheating husband. And I'll tell you, I know from having seen it perform, it still speaks very strongly, to women. But she goes on, she rehearses all of these things. She recapitulates Hercules' labors, and she's trying to say, how is she going to defeat him? And she realizes she's going to defeat him by making him mad. So this strength turns to herself. And so at the very end, she's summoning up, because Hercules has unwittingly opened the underworld up. And so there's now free transit, from these things. And she says, and then she ends with a kind of spell. Now servants of the underworld begin. The fire of vengeance rage. Now servants of the underworld begin. The fires of vengeance rage. Electo lead the hissing furies out of hell, and let each loathsome goddess snatch a burning brand from the infernal pyre. Now on to work, revenge the desecration of the six. And then she gives this this spell, and then she goes, whenever she gets incredibly mad, she pretends to be reasonable for a moment, then she gets even vengeance. So what Seneca does is create this rhetorical thing of anger, calm, into this kind of pyramid, of anger, and where she's only invoking the infernal spirits. And then she goes, and if I haven't always been a good stepmother to my husband's gifted son, today I'll make amends. I'll stand beside him when frenzy blurs his sight and help him send each arrow to its unsuspected mark. I'll be his staunchest ally in the fight, and when he finishes his giddy slaughter, I'll have him raise his dripping hands to Jove and ask for admission into heaven. I see the first bright tracings of the dawn. The pine is set, and now I must be calm. She never reappears. And it's just this kind of great overture of vengeance and violence. And so, and that's what I tried to do. The choruses I tried to do, different thing where I'd catch the mood of these things, and and it's meant to be played. It's meant to work on stage.
Right. Yeah. To what extent do you think someone can understand it merely from reading?
Well, I think it's very clear to be read. I mean, in order to read the play, you need to know the 12 labors of Hercules, because they're referred to all the time, and you need to know the Roman Olympian gods, Jupiter. You don't need much else. The rest is self-explanatory. When he goes into the underworld, he really gives a kind of guided tour. He tells you how you get down there, each river you cross, what you come to.
Right.
And it's really, so I think it's actually a very accessible play. Now, the choruses are a little different because the way a Greek tragedy operates and the way a Roman tragedy is, you have the action, and then you have the chorus commenting on it. And so the choral odes are sort of poems that separate the acts. And so those can be a little more difficult, but that's why I tried to make them, more, I try to make them clearer, and I try to make them musical. I did each of them in rhyme, and I changed the meter so that you capture the mood. I mean, in one case, it begins with a very gloomy thing, but then the chorus sees that Hercules has, come out of hell, and so they figure that things are all right, so they shift meter. And in Thebes has come the joyful day. On each high altar we will slay our choicest sacrificial beast. Now to prepare the lavish feast, summon the workers from the field and taste the fruits their labors yield. I don't think that's difficult poetry.
Right.
But, it's a lot of times when you see choruses translated, they're translating this musical Latin into obscure prose. And what you got to do is you got to figure the tune and deliver the tune, because most of what poetry communicates is by rhythm and sound.
Yeah, that's right.
So I try to bring that across. But I think actually, the play plays pretty well. I mean, if you don't know who Hercules is, and you don't know at least a few of the labors, and you don't know who Jupiter and Juno are, you are in trouble, because it's but it's basically, there's Jupiter above, Pluto below, Juno who's mad at everybody, and Hercules. That's the extent that the Olympian pantheon really is called into question. The opening thing talks about the zodiac, but actually anybody who's interested in astrology or astronomy probably knows all of those. Right. You know who the Pleiades are, and you know who Taurus is, and things like that. So curious, since so much of our culture was codified in Rome, that our months are named, some of our months are named after, we have 2 months named after Roman emperors, July and August, and we have these, we have our planets are named after the Roman Olympian. They're not unfamiliar names.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I suppose it's certainly comprehensible, but I suppose there's a question that comes to mind, which is, if you merely read the piece to, or do you need to embody it in order to get that extra, amount of dramatic knowledge or embodied knowledge?
Well, I agree. A play should be seen, or you could hear them. I actually have got a CD set of all Shakespeare's plays, and others and I'll drive someplace. My wife doesn't like it here. My kids don't like it. But if I'm by myself, I actually enjoy listening to Midsummer Night's Dream or, Timon of Athens or something like this, because I don't have a chance to see these things. But it's because I've seen them that I can register. But, a play should be seen. But when I was young, I couldn't go to the theater. I didn't want to go to the theater. There was not that much theater in Los Angeles. And so a lot of times I would just read a play at night. And so I read a lot of famous plays. And I talked about over there, we talked during the break about a science fiction writer I know, Thomas Dish. Some people will know some of his novels like Camp Concentration, or even, one of his kids' books, The Brave Little Toaster. And, but Tom was the same way. When he was young, he would read plays. We talked about, we read all of Tennessee Williams' plays, and we read these. And a lot of these I've still never seen, but I know from having read. So until people put on Seneca, reading the book is probably the best you could do. What I'd love to do is to do another semi-staged reading and record it. I think it works well, and the actors, I try to make the voice of each of the characters somewhat different. Bacchus, who is the fellow who usurps the government, I made him sound like a Southern politician. Just it's reasonable, calm, and he's, always trying to strike a deal. And so because you have to sort of differentiate the actors. But I did the best I could. And I'm hoping somebody will read it and say, gee, I'd like to produce it, which is why at the end of the thing, I put suggestions for production, because in case somebody wants to do it, I have a little note called a translator's note. And then I just say, to a director wishing to mount the play, I offer the following suggestions. I talk about the acting style. I talk about how you do the chorus. I talk about how you make cuts. And somebody will do it. I think so.
I hope so. That'd be fantastic.
Somebody crazy, like my friend Richard Ryan, who did his first production. Probably because we were both, See, there's certain times when if you drink enough, certain projects seem plausible that wouldn't seem plausible if you were sober. And the funny thing is that they often work, because it removes your inhibitions and you do it. So, when you drink, don't get in a car, but do produce a play.
Right. You also have the line, as a philosopher, I think, or maybe Herodotus says this about the Persians, where they would consider an idea sober, and then it would also be crucial to see how it passes when.
Well, you do. Next morning as you wake up. Well, we did. Years ago, I created a writers' conference. A friend of mine and I were at my parents' house in Sebastopol, and we had a bottle of Pinot Noir, and we began drinking it. And we talked about how, there's 2,500 writers' conferences in the United States, but there's not one that you could go to and learn how to write in meter, have anybody critique about your use of rhyme or doing verse narrative. And we thought it would be nice to have a conference that actually taught the traditional techniques of poetry by poets who use them. And so by the time we finished the bottle of wine, we did it. And everyone told us we were crazy. We didn't have a budget. We didn't have a staff, anything. But we did it. And I just did it by sheer force of will and persuasion. And 4 years later, we were the largest poetry conference in the United States because we were doing something different from everyone else. And we were trying to do it really well and to create an atmosphere that when young writers came, we treated people as equals. It was a positive, kind of respectful, fun atmosphere. We ran it for 20, some years. I had to move on. And when the two founders left, it sort of faltered because people didn't keep it on strategy. But as long as you kept it on strategy, you had, more people than you could deal with almost.
Mhm. Yep.
So I'm all for the divine madness of Bacchus, to mention another member of the Roman pantheon.
Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about how you see this play fitting in with Seneca's philosophy. We've touched on it some, but is there a general theory you have about this?
Well, there has been an argument among classicists saying that, well, the person who wrote these plays and the person who wrote Seneca's essays are two different people. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't take that argument very seriously. And the reason I don't is that pretty much everything that there was to know about classical literature was known by 1900. The texts were established, except for a couple of fragments of Sappho and a little Greek, a comedy of Menander. There's been no new texts, and so since the texts are there, they've been edited, they've been annotated. About all you could do is then challenge what the consensus is. So you have to, anything anybody says, you have to challenge. And so I think, to a certain degree, the argument that Seneca Tragicus was not, Seneca, Philosophus is a hollow one. I think it's a rhetorical argument. You could publish an article on it. And why now? Seneca's essays are very clean, very concise. The tragedies are grandiose and violent and everything else. But I think it's, if I take a writer and I have him write an essay, and then I have him write a novel, you get two different sides of their personality. And I think that I don't think I know, when Seneca is writing essays, he's writing in his own person. Mm-hmm. He's saying, I am an example of Roman Stoicism, and I will set a good example for you, my friend. So he's writing he's writing a letter to somebody, but the letter is a letter that you're supposed to then come and read to all your friends. Sure. So Seneca is writing letters to posterity, really, to all Rome and to posterity. In the plays, he has the luxury of putting words into the mouths of fictional characters. So he can have Hercules, or he can have Medea, or Juno say things that he would never say in his first person. And so I believe that Seneca used his plays to reflect his anxiety, anger, and suppressed violence about his sense of what life had become in imperial Rome. And I think they're vehicles for all of these darker emotions, which as a Stoic, he knew he must control in his life. And so, you think of Edgar Allan Poe as a very meek, very polite man. He drank a lot, but the stories are violent and crazy. He channeled this. You see this again and again, that the H.P. Lovecrafts of the world are very mild-mannered, polite people. Their imagination kind of goes wild. So I think, for Seneca, this became a form in which he could channel his darker energy and his darker vision, free of the weight of being an exemplary Stoic. Now, does that mean that the plays contradict his Stoic philosophy? No, they show the consequences of immoderate behavior. They show the consequences of not controlling your darker passions, because they are tragedies. They are about great people who come to bad ends because of essential flaws in their character. So it's a dramatization of Seneca, of Stoic principles.
Absolutely.
And I think it's they're more expansive and flamboyant than the Greek plays. And what Seneca reminds me of is opera and movies. The way that opera, time stops and Violetta makes you feel what's going on in her heart. And you have this tremendous emotional transference. And that's what I saw operating when we did the stage production. That's why I said, don't try to do realistic drama where, you do this and you walk over here and you pour a glass of water and you light a cigarette. Just go there and be Maria Callas breaking the audience's heart. And people have this emotional transference. And the other thing is that they have this kind of inevitable violence. There's a wonderful scene in, a version of Antigone that was written after World War II by Gérard Bedore. And it begins when the chorus comes out and says, here's Antigone. She's just a girl. Mm-hmm. She dreams of marriage, she dreams of this. But the machine of tragedy has been turned on. And once this machine has been turned on, it cannot be stopped. And that's what Seneca's doing, is that before the play opens up, Juno has put into effect this tragic tidal wave. And until that wave lands and crushes everything in its path, the action isn't over. And so, and what's going to happen. The tragedy is not about surprise. It's about witnessing what do strong people do when they are pushed to the outer extremities of human suffering. When the worst things in the world happen to them and they still resist breaking, but they have to articulate their suffering. And it's a very strange art form in that respect, because what they're doing is something that nobody wants to see, and yet we're drawn to. It's like a traffic accident. Right. People always slow down because they want to see the accident. There's a crime scene. They want to see. There's a desire, in a sense, to see the worst fates that we might encounter, and that's in the Greek tragedies. But here, it's on an imperial level. In Rome, is bigger productions, bigger budget, wider screen, and Technicolor.
One thing that was just brought to mind was Seneca in On Anger talks about how anger is not merely an immediate reaction. Lots of people react to something out of frustration, but anger is the madness that sort of takes over when that initial impression, the Stoics would say, is agreed to. You assent to that initial impression and become angry, become mad. And you're just saying that the play sort of takes on at that very point where reason has left, and all there is different forms of anger.
Well, what's interesting about Seneca is this notion, and you see it in the letters, but you see it throughout the tragedies, that there's a kind of pollution that happens to you when you indulge your darker emotions. And I think we see it in life, that there's a kind of, you do it, then you sort of acclimatize yourself then, and it grows and grows until there's a point where you no longer are controlled. Or like Juno, at some level, Juno is not even conscious of how evil she is, because the anger allows her to justify her cruelty, her rationality. And then it's carried on at a magic level or a mythic level, and that merely immersing yourself in the underworld, you can't get the stain off, when you leave. And I think that's a rather profound psychological point, that the actions that we take change us in ways that we eventually can no longer detect or control. And that we have to, in a sense, understand where we're going. And that's the interesting thing about Seneca on anger is that you just stop and it's almost you sleep on it. And you see that by the next day, so much of your motivation was irrational and it's dissipated. And it would have been self-destructive. I mean, how many people that we're talking to have sent an email that they regretted 5 minutes later? You really should just, if you have to vent it, write it, but don't send it for an hour. And chances are you'll delete it or you'll revise it. And so, and so it's really about controlling your emotions. I mean, with Seneca, in some ways, it's very simple. It's that you can't control the world. All you can control is your reaction to it. And it's a little like Alcoholics Anonymous. Is that you accept what you can't, control, and you work with what you can. I think it's in general, my impression at 18, reading Seneca for the first time, remains my impression at 72. His philosophy makes a lot of sense. That Stoicism represents a very practical, effective set of values by which to lead your life. I mean, we have more control over our lives than Romans did. I mean, a Roman who survived infancy probably could look forward to living about 30 years on the average. We can look forward to living nearly 80 years. And so we have, more time to enjoy, more time to make mistakes. I love one of Seneca's remarks, which is that he says that no life is too short. But he also says it's not that life is short, but that we waste so much of it. And I think that that's part of the energy of Stoicism. If you accept the inevitability of mortality, your choice is basically to drift there, or to use every moment until then as wisely as possible. And it's the way that St. Jerome, who was a great fan of Seneca's, kept a skull on his desk, his memento mori, so that at every moment he was reminded he would die, and then not to waste his life. It's interesting to me, and I happened to sit next to a famous psychologist on an airplane about a month ago, and we were talking, and she asked me, was I happy, and this, that, and all these questions. And she just, and I knew they were kind of standard questions, and her field was, how does your age and your part of life affect your happiness? And I said, well, in my 70s, I'm much happier than I was as a young man. And she said, what was your worst year? I said, probably when I was about 50. And she says, you're right. It's exactly. But I think part of it is that if you make it to my age, and unfortunately, some of my dearest friends did not make it to my age, either through bad luck or bad behavior. You don't take anything for granted. You just, every day seems more of a gift, and you enjoy things. And I think my wife and I are both slightly astonished at the joy that we have in our life. But I think it comes from approaching life from a stance of gratitude. I was so busy struggling with life, struggling with destiny, struggling with all these things when I was young, that, I didn't have gratitude. I didn't have any ease in things. This was existence was a battle. And you realize that, the thing that I quoted before, that you have to let your life guide you. You have to go with the current of your life, and it will if you're skillful enough, it'll take you where you need to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I do think that Stoicism, if people that know it, but have outside, they have a sense that Stoicism is some kind of test about how much pain you can endure. maybe they've read Madness of Hercules, but it isn't. It's really about putting yourself in an attitude towards life that you don't worry about too much about the things you can't control, and you are grateful for those things that you have. And it's not a bad, I was raised by people that had very hard lives, were relatively poor, were always working hard, and they were joyful.
Mm-hmm.
They, they took joy in things that nowadays people I don't think appreciate as much in marriage, in family, in relations, in the holidays, the few holidays they were given from their work, and they didn't waste those things.
Right. Yeah, Epictetus has a line about treating everything you have as if it's on loan from fate.
Which it
is.
I mean, it's, it's like the comment about beer. You don't buy beer, you rent it. But that's the thing about existence. And even if you believe in eternal life, you'll never be 20 again. You'll never be 30 again. You'll never have a newborn child again. You'll never, you're about to get married. You'll never, in a sense, merge your life with somebody else in a celebration of marriage. These moments that come, and if you don't seize the day doesn't come again. Another day comes, but it's different. And this poem I wrote that again, it's called The Road. It goes, he sometimes thought that he had missed his life by being far too busy looking for it. Searching the distance, he often turned to find that he had passed some milestone unaware. And I think that's the way a lot of people, especially very successful men. And I don't, maybe people don't agree with me. I think Stoicism is more a male philosophy in a traditional sense, about people who have to go out and struggle with the world, people who may face military conscription, people who, are given, difficult, work in which they really only have the internal resources of their own individuality to face, versus but the traditional Roman sense female role, which is this creation of a home, this web of family relations that help support you. But I find it a joyful and realistic stance, which I think is completely compatible with my Catholicism and comes very naturally out of my Mexican and my Italian heritage.
Yeah, I do think many modern Stoics underrate the importance of gratitude, as you were mentioning earlier, in the philosophy. Marcus Aurelius, his first book of the Meditations, is a long list of people who have helped to.
Yeah. Well, there's a kind of militant undercurrent of a lot of sort of the new Stoics, and I think it's they feel embattled by society and they feel they have to fight their way into being able to articulate and express themselves, and this is probably an authentic reaction from their personal circumstances. But as somebody who's like on the other side of that, towards the end of my life, I think that to be open to the grace of existence and to approach life from an aspect of gratitude is it's the secret to happiness. So rather than arguing about what you have and what you didn't have and what you've missed and this, that, or the other, you start with what you have and you're thankful for it. Anybody who's had a serious accident, let's say you can't walk for a couple of months, and then you walk again. Being able to walk is what a gift. You can't. Let's say you go through some financial distress, and then having a little bit of money just to be able to indulge yourself becomes this extraordinary gift. Or if you've been separated from people for a long time, and you come back to your family or whatever. And so I think we take so much for granted, especially in our society now, because we're given so much. So people are given so much they don't even have a chance to enjoy it. And I think Stoicism, which is moderate what you have so that you enjoy what you get. Not bad advice.
Yeah, no, be moderate, nothing in excess.
Because you think of Roman society in the West, maybe Persians may have been like this, with the first society of luxury and excess, where people, because of the extent of the empire and the wealth of the empire, the people, especially the ruling caste of Rome, had fantastic material wealth compared to what had
been, sure.
Earlier eras. I mean, you look at the palaces and things like that. They're, even by today's standards, they're rather extraordinary. And, there's a kind of drunkenness that can give you. You see it in the United States, where you just, people are so, I should talk for all the books I've got. I'm the poster boy for bibliomanic excess. But except for my books, I think I'm not, I'm fairly, not Spartan, but I'm, certainly stoic in my appetites. People are just busy getting stuff and more stuff and more stuff and more stuff. And I think it's a kind of delusion, as if having more is going to make you happy. Anyway, but it's, I'm bloviating.
Well, that brings to mind the contemporary of Seneca, Musonius Rufus. He always castigates his students for living in luxury. And one thing that came to mind the other day is, today the typical person probably has about as much energy at their disposal as a Roman with 200 slaves or something like this. Is the sort of thing that people estimate. So he would be much harsher even on the typical person, perhaps.
My wife and I do a serious fast during Lent and during Advent, and we simply cut back, we cut all these things out of our diet, we eat less, and it's clarifying. But first of all, I think I lost about 10 pounds, but you become conscious of your appetites, that you're so busy satisfying you almost forget. And hunger is a very clarifying and actually energizing physical impulse, and so I found that it was there was a kind of joy in fasting. I think there's, in our culture, that pleasure is often found in people that are doing bodybuilding or jogging or whatever, where they have a kind of spiritual discipline that is expressed in physical exhaustion, physical transformation. And I think that that's very sound. I do think it's a diminishment if you're doing it for your body, but not for your emotions, your mind, your imagination. There is, I think, a great shortcoming of American education and American culture in that we don't know how to educate our emotions. And certainly that's the main message, I think, of Stoicism. It's not saying, giving you an intellectual regimen. It's not giving you a physical regimen, though he recommends things in both regards. But what Seneca and the Stoics are saying is that achieving a kind of emotional perspective and maturity is the key to managing everything else in your life. And I do think if you look at American education, the emotional component is almost blank. They have rules, they have punishments, but they don't know, in a sense, how to, especially for boys, I don't think that they know how to take all the natural impulses and to cultivate and refine them to be productive rather than destructive. And what great civilizations do is to take all this potentially destructive energy and turn it into positive energy, positive out towards positive outcomes. That is, in some ways, the benefit of arts education, which, in my own argument of why I think Seneca wrote his plays, it allows you to channel the energies towards productive means. And I'll give you an example that I learned in band. My high school in Los Angeles was not a particularly distinguished high school. It was an all-boys Catholic school. And the brothers' main objective, I think, was to keep us from going to reform school because it was in a rough neighborhood. And in fact, a lot of the guys there were getting into trouble. But we did have the best band in Southern California, the Metro Los Angeles area, which is quite a distinction. And it was just the action of having some very good band masters. And so I went into this thing, and it was serious music in the way that a lot of the bad school had a serious sports program. In fact, my high school, long after I left it, produced the best football team of any high school its size in California. Now, what I learned in band was full of young men that were potential criminals. They were explosive, they were violent, they were intemperate. But you give them some drums to beat, you give them a trombone to play, and they sort of put the energy into that. I mean, they would make rude noises, the breaks and things like that. But what it did is that it gave them the channel, and then, like a sports team, it had them play together. And they learned, in a sense, to focus their energy and to work for a kind of collective positive outcome. And in a very subtle way, what was the way it was beauty. The beauty of the music they were creating, which was intoxicating to the people performing. If you're performing music and it's working, you feel it 10 times as deeply as the audience does. It becomes transfiguring. But it was a way of controlling and channeling your emotions and working for the outcome way down the road with these rude noises that you make when you begin turn into melody, turn into harmony. And I do think that if you took young people and you put them in theater, you put them in band, you put them in maybe debates, just as putting them in football or basketball or baseball, you educate and refine their emotions in ways you can't do otherwise. Otherwise, you meant it's suppressing them. You're yelling at them. You're forbidding them things versus channeling it. And so I was lucky in that respect. And I see this even when I was teaching at USC. I had musicians. I taught whenever possible, I taught in their school, the Thorpe School of Music. I had musicians who, versus the scholars and the scientists, were completely different human beings. But they'd found in music a way of developing and expressing their personality, their intelligence. And their intelligence was not probably often the intelligence that was analytical or numerical in any way. It was a kind of an expressive intelligence in very productive ways. And the difference between the poets and the musicians, which is why the musicians were happier, is they were the artists that quite literally played together versus the people that saw themselves as loners, as being alienated from one another, and who began in a sense to cultivate their own unhappiness, which I think is a temptation for an artist or an intellectual, a kind of self-righteous cultivation of your superiority that since the world doesn't see can only be expressed through your resentments and anxiety and unhappiness. But I think it's not a bad thing for an artist to be happy.
Yeah, I'd say that for people in general. Well, is there anything else you'd like to add? This has been fantastic.
Thank you for putting up with me. I'm just go on and on and on. It's a pleasure to talk to you. It's been a surprise and a reward for me to discover your community, if I could call it that, which is this movement of New Stoics, of these young people that are in very different ways are, going back to classical ideas and Stoic ideas in particular. And you give me hope for intellectual life, because almost in every case you're working outside of the university. You have the benefits of an academic training, but you, for whatever reasons, declined to be circumscribed by academic life. You're living in the broader world, but you're holding on to your education, and you're sharing it through books, through podcasts, through coaching. And I think that is of enormous significance to our future. And so, I'm grateful to discover you, and I'm grateful for any attention that you throw my way.
Glad to hear it. Thanks so much,
Okay.
Dana Gioia. Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. If you'd like to get 2 meditations from me on Stoic theory and practice a week, just 2 short emails on whatever I've been thinking about, as well as some of the best resources we found for practicing Stoicism, check out stoaletter.com. It's completely free. You can sign up for it and then unsubscribe at any time as you wish. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.